Hello, hidden gems. It's Lauren and John, as I always joke. Surprise, as if you thought it would be somebody else. When I say it's Lauren and
Yeah,
John, your
yeah.
co-hosts, your host of Hidden True Crime. John is for those of you that are new to our channel, Dr. John is a forensic and clinical psychologist and who has worked for decades with offenders as well as victims. And I am his wife and co host, and I am a journalist and was a television reporter. And the case that we're about to discuss live with you tonight is the Madeline Soto case. It's a case that many have been asking us to cover. It's a case that we have both been delving into because there are so many documents that the police have released, and it is difficult to say the least what has come out. I have done separate videos with those documents sharing the evidence, and I recommend everyone can go there to hear that full background. John has also done an initial show about this case a couple of months ago, but we are going to delve in deeper to discover what is hidden, and I'm going to give the majority of the time to you tonight, John, because you are who we want to hear from tonight. I was even on Web Sleuth last night and I kept saying, I'm confused. I'm confused. We all are waiting to hear what you have to say to help us make sense of this absolute tragedy. So, this is also a trigger warning, of course. This is a case that is difficult. It includes a child, it includes abuse, is and Madeline is no longer with us here. Her body was found March 1st in a wooded area in Florida of this year, and Stefan Sturms has been arrested in her murder. So that's where we are, and since that time, other things that he did to Madeline for years and years and years has been released. So just a heads up to anyone that might need to pace themselves or perhaps take some time. Dr. John, I'll give it to you.
So a lot has changed, obviously, since we first talked about this case. We have all the documents and so much more information, and there's so many tidbits in the documents that it took me. I had to go through it a few times to really start putting it together, because there's pieces here and there that are really critical that are easy to overlook. So this really was an interesting puzzle. I think in our last show about this, I kind of started with the premise that maybe this was just another case of a psychopath who murders a child. And that's a scenario that we talk about all the time. And it can be interesting, but I think we're kind of used to that analysis a little bit. And I wasn't sure we were going to pick this up again, because I was worried that maybe that's all this case was, but it's not. It's a lot more than that. It's significantly more than that. And there's so much about Stefan Sturms now that I'm beginning to understand that I didn't before. And so I think it's really important to talk about some of those issues. But I want to start with Madeline. I think the more I went through these documents, the more sorrow I think I felt, and the more sad. This is a really hard case for me that, it just really pulled on my heartstrings, because I kept feeling all the time that this poor girl, this 13-year-old girl, who had known Stefan Sturms since she was 6.
Yes.
So Stefan came into her life when he was 30. She was 6. And he has been in her life for 7 years. So keep that in mind. This is 7 years of potentially ongoing crimes. But the more I looked at these documents and really tried to understand Madeline, the more I kind of had this sense that she was almost invisible. Like, nobody saw this girl. And it, to me, that's one of the big tragedies here, is that there's this real invisibility. And, Madeline talks about this desire when she's 13, and she just turned 13 a few weeks before she was murdered. But she talks about turning 13 and then going off to live alone in the woods. And I mean, you could say that she wasn't serious about that, but she talked about it a lot. And even if you see that as more metaphorical, it's almost like this victim goes from being invisible to those around her to going in the woods and wanting to completely disappear. And that's just heartbreaking. There was a moment in here when I read, there was an interview in one of the documents by the Kissimmee Police Department, one of the detectives, and the detective did an interview with Madeline's best friend. I'm not going to mention the best friend's name. It is in the document. It's not redacted, but I'm going to refer to the best friend as S. And I just want to read a little bit about what S says about Madeline. This is fairly insignificant, I think, in terms of understanding this whole case, and yet it's not. This is like one of those moments that really, at least for me, it's something you really would easily overlook in these documents, but it really grabbed me. And it's so this friend S is talking about Madeline's birthday party, and S says, the detective asked how Madeline was acting at her party, and S said, quote, "She stated when she got there, meaning when Madeline got there, she was getting upset. S then explained that Madeline was upset because some of her friends canceled going to the party the day before.
Mm.
So she's got these friends. She's anticipating they're going to be there. This is the 13th birthday party. She's excited for this. And all of a sudden, all of her friends cancel.
Oh.
They're not going to show up. And Madeline is really shaken by this. She's upset. At the very least, she wants her friends to show up, because we already know that her mother doesn't really see her. She's invisible to her mother in many ways, because her mother is so self-absorbed, and because her mother is so invested in this relationship with Stefan that she treats Madeline in many ways as kind of non-existent. We know that there's a history of conflict between Jennifer, who's the mother, and Madeline, that they fight a lot. There's a point in these documents where one of the friends says that Jennifer tells Madeline, "I can't wait until you turn 18 so that I can basically put you out in the streets and let go of you. I just want to get rid of you." She says that.
Wow.
But here we have this 13-year-old girl. She just turned 13. She has all these expectations of this birthday party, and then her friends all cancel, except for one. There's one friend who decided to go. Her best friend showed up, S showed up, and then another friend showed up. Her initial is E. I'll just refer to her as E. And when E showed up, Madeline cheered up considerably, but she was still upset that all of her other friends basically abandoned her for this party. And then S goes on. Quote, "S assumed Madeline was upset at the party because Jennifer was not there. So all of her friends cancel on her, and her mother doesn't show up either. Her mother doesn't show up because she started a new job, and she wanted to focus on her job. She wanted to get some sleep. Right?
Yeah.
She too essentially abandons her child. And you might say, okay, it's a birthday party. Is it really that big of a deal? It is to Madeline. It is
Yes.
to a 13-year-old girl who has a limited number of friends, who's really not seen at school. She's not seen at home. She's not really seen anywhere. It matters to her. And I think it matters to understanding this case, this idea of invisibility and not being seen and not being heard. We received so many emails, and I just want to apologize to many of our listeners out there who write to us. We try to read them. We can't get to all of them. We certainly can't respond, and we wish we could, but we could spend all day responding to emails, and we have so much work to do. So, but we did see this email, and I just want to read quickly a piece of it. This is from one of our gems. The gem says, quote, "I believe in my heart that Maddie's story is hitting so many people because her mother didn't listen. We are disgusted and triggered by Jen. I hope you will touch on this more and help us deal with the deep wounds that are there as a result of our mothers not protecting us." So here we have an email from a gem who's saying that this story really resonated her for some of the reasons I just identified. That she's saying that Jen didn't listen to her daughter. Jen didn't see her daughter. So we have the same idea, I think, that, that nobody sees her. As far as Stefan goes, I want to talk about this idea of invisibility with Stefan. He sees her. He just sees her as an object.
Right.
He sees her as an object to be used for his own gratification.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't see her for who she is, or for what she's feeling, or for what she wants or desires or needs. He doesn't care about any of that. And her friends, as I just pointed out, her friends really don't see her either, sadly. So, I think a big part of our discussion tonight should be, how and why did this happen? How is it that all these people are not able to see her and to understand her?
Yeah.
I there's some documents where the police conducted interviews with a number of friends and some school personnel, teachers, guidance counselors. And I want to just I want to read a few of those, or at least summarize what some of the people said. A 33-year-old teacher, name is redacted. I wouldn't read it anyway, but a 33-year-old teacher was interviewed. The teacher said that Madeline was always, quote, fatigued, unquote, which the teacher took to be a sign of depression. A student told this teacher also that Madeline just wanted to live in the woods when she turned 13. So this was being repeated so much that it was getting back to teachers.
Right.
Another friend, a different friend, not the best friend, another 13-year-old friend said that, quote, Madeline cried often. And she would often tell me, I just want to cry. So even at school, Madeline can't suppress this deep sorrow, this invisibility, not being seen. Another 12-year-old friend said in the interview with one of the detectives, quote, she seemed pretty sad all the time. A school counselor, this is important, a school counselor was interviewed. The school counselor said that Madeline had come to visit the counselor 6 times since the beginning of the school year. Madeline would talk about, with the counselor, Madeline talked about anxiety and panic attacks. She talked about the constant fights with her mother. She described Stefan as, quote, weird. And she said she, quote, didn't like him because he makes me feel uncomfortable, unquote.
Wow.
It's interesting to note that the school counselor also said that in December, January, Madeline's grades improved significantly. They went from a D average up to passing.
Wow.
December happens to be the exact month that Stefan left the home and moved back to Northport, Florida.
Yeah. He left and moved out.
So another thing to know about Madeline is that the detectives identified that from some of her records that she had been diagnosed with ADHD. Her mother, Jennifer, had said that she was believed to have autism, although that apparently was changing. She was also diagnosed with some type of anxiety disorder, which could have been the panic attacks the school counselor identified. When I look at this, when I look at these interviews, my first thought is these would all be signs of depression. And again, I'm not diagnosing here. I need to put on my shirt saying I'm not diagnosing. But I guess people are used to me saying that. But what's interesting to me is that all these people, all these friends and people at school identified all these symptoms of depression, the crying all the time. There's more, by the way. Another one of her friends said that Madeline talked about running away and living in the woods, and that Jen threatened to kick her out of the house and disown her when she turned 18. The friend also said that Madeline, quote, she went through a depressive phase earlier in the year, unquote, and she wore red makeup, which made it look like she was crying. So presumably she wore red makeup because she was trying to cover up her tears or constant crying. So what's interesting about this to me, though, is you've got all these people identifying all these symptoms of depression. And yet the detectives asked almost all of them, do you think she was depressed? And they all said, no, she's not depressed.
Huh.
So getting back to this idea, like, who is looking out for this girl? Who is seeing this girl and her needs? Does anyone see that she's depressed? Does anyone see that she needs help? Right? Like, it's so frustrating to go through these docs and to see these signs over and over. Not a single person really connects to that depression. Not a single person connects to her loneliness and her isolation, including, obviously, her mother. You know, the school counselor is interesting because Madeline talked about Stefan with the school counselor, and the Madeline described Stefan as weird and making her feel uncomfortable. Now, if if a 13-year-old came in my office and said somebody is weird and makes me feel uncomfortable, I'd say, tell me more about that. How are you so uncomfortable around this person? But there's no indication whatsoever that, I mean, maybe the school counselor asked her that, but it doesn't seem like the person did. It just seems like Madeline said, you know, he makes me feel uncomfortable. Okay, well, why? So again, you know, there's all these people that she's surrounded by that just really don't seem to grasp the fact that she's struggling and that she seems very depressed. And even the people closest to her, obviously, her mother seems incapable of making that assessment. And so I think I want to lead with this because we want to give Madeline a voice. And I want to acknowledge all these struggles that she was encountering and how, in some ways, she was screaming to be seen and nobody cared. Nobody was willing to look and see and notice her depression. I mean, people noticed her anxiety, I guess. She had panic attacks, but when
Right.
somebody, when a 12, 13-year-old is coming to school and crying all the time, when she's falling asleep at school, when a teacher notices that she's fatigued and probably depressed, and nobody seems to care, to me, that's problematic. So I just want to lead talking about Madeline because that's why we're doing this. And
Thank you.
there's so much in these documents that really give her a voice and also show the extent to which I think she was overlooked, that she became invisible. And I think because she felt that way, all she wanted to do was run away and go live in the woods. And I know that's probably metaphorical. Of course, it's not lost on me that, or hopefully, probably our gems too, that the woods symbolically in literature and especially in fairy tales represent danger and the unknown, and that's where Little Red Riding Hood goes and is chased by the big bad wolf. That's where Hansel and Gretel encounter the witch who wants to eat them, right? So the woods
Right.
typically aren't seen as a safe place where you go to get away and escape. The woods are usually the opposite. And here you have a 13-year-old girl who wants to run away to the woods that, I think for most kids would be terrifying.
Right. I
So
agree. She wants
I
to run to the place that we're all scared of as children.
yeah, right. How bad does it have to be to want to run to the place that most of us want to avoid at all costs? She wants to go out in the woods and apparently confront the dragons and monsters and witches and demons. And wow, I mean, that should have been a red flag right there.
Right.
So by way of introduction, I think I want to pay tribute to Madeline, and I hope we can give her a voice by really delving into some of the deeper issues that are going on in this case. And there's a lot of them. So I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but it is a heartbreaking case. And these are the kinds of little tidbits in these documents that I kept running into that are just so heartbreaking.
Thank you to those that are with us tonight. You can let your friends know we're here too. Thank you for giving a voice to Madeline.
Well, we'll do our best. So I want to talk about, the email I just read is very critical of Jennifer, obviously, and I think that has been a big part of this case is, what did Jennifer know? Why didn't Jennifer intervene? Right? What kind of mother would kind of throw her child to the wolves, Um,
Those are the questions. Yeah, many people have.
how is that possible? So I want to talk about both Stefan and Jennifer. I don't know. I'm not sure which order to go in. But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, when it came to our first podcast, you said in order to understand Lori Vallow, we needed to understand Chad. Is there a bit of that here, or could it be either or?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think um, I think this case is about Stefan Stearns this case begins and ends with Stephen Stearns, because if Stephen Stearns doesn't enter the picture, or if Stephen Stearns had a moral compass, we wouldn't be talking tonight. You know, it's true that Jennifer is no heroic mother. That's for sure. That there's a lot to talk about with Jen, and we'll talk about it. But I think you have to start with the premise that this crime is committed by Stephen Stearns. Now it's possible. I said this on our first show. It's possible the police may find evidence implicating Jen as a co-conspirator, but so far I haven't seen that evidence. So right now, my presumption is that Stephen acted alone, and as far as we know, Jennifer may be a horrible mother, but it's not. I can't reach the conclusion at this point that Jennifer was involved in the murder or knew about the murder or participated in it. So in that sense, I think it's really important to place blame where it belongs, and that's with Stephen Stearns.
Okay. Yes. That's what we're seeing so far. It's the only thing we can. And he is the only person charged at this time.
It doesn't appear at all. I mean, Jennifer did make some inconsistent statements.
Yes, she did.
She said that she initially said that she saw her daughter Madeline on the morning that she disappeared. Then she changed that and said that she didn't see her. She said that she heard her getting ready for school. However,
big difference.
Yeah, big difference, right? Big difference. But even I have a question there too, by the way. Even hearing her, I don't know. I question that. My guess is that Madeline was deceased by the time that Stephen left the home in the morning.
Correct.
To supposedly take her to school.
I agree.
So, right. So Jen is saying that she heard her. I don't know how that's possible if she's deceased. So
she heard footsteps and she heard Stephen. Right.
Right, but she's
claiming she heard her.
She's claiming that she heard Madeline alive. I mean, I don't know if she's not very specific about it, but
right, I disagree.
Did she
didn't.
What does that mean? Did she hear her voice? Right, yeah. It seems unlikely that she actually heard Madeline in any real sense. So let's start with Stephen. I don't know. It's hard. This is going to be an intense discussion here, and it's just a trigger warning here. There's going to be a lot I'm going to talk about here that could be upsetting, and much of it could be of a sexual nature. Because of YouTube, I'm going to have to really restrict my vocabulary, or do the best to restrict it. But
this is what John does. By the way, he assesses criminals, but more specifically, he's worked with more sex offenders than any other criminal.
Yeah, I've worked with hundreds of sex offenders, and the reason that's true is because in the criminal justice system, sex offenders are the most difficult to place. Sex offenders are the most difficult to assess and to place in the community or not, or to have them stay in prison. It depends on their crimes, but when somebody is murdered, there's less of a gray area. But with sex offenders, there's much more of a gray area. If a sex offender engages in sadistic sexual homicide, there's not much of a gray area. But with the sex offense, obviously it's a huge trauma and it's horrible. But especially with first-time sex offenders, the system is more open-minded about giving them a chance. With repeat offenders, it's a little more clear cut. But that means that the system, the judicial system, has more uncertainty. They need more forensic evaluators like myself to assess sex offenders because of the gray area, because it's not as clear cut. Whereas, typically if you murder someone, and the evidence is overwhelming, you're not going to be eligible for parole or probation in the community. I mean, and oftentimes murderers will take a deal right away to avoid the death penalty, or to avoid going to trial, or so but sex offenders, it's much more complicated. And so let's start with that. So Stefan Stearns, just based on what was found, the images and videos that were found on his phone, is undoubtedly a sex offender. I mean, he hasn't been adjudicated. He's not a convicted sex offender yet. So I guess I have to say he's an alleged sex offender. But there are images and pictures. So, let me say this. They found over 35,000 images and videos depicting exploitative material involving children. That's a lot. It's a huge number. In some states, that'll get you life alone. In addition to that, they found thousands of pictures of him specifically with the victim here. Not one, not two, thousands. And that's, by the way, that is why he was so nervous about his phone, about police confiscating his phone. That's why when he went up to visit his parents, he tried to get on their Wi-Fi to get into his accounts to delete all the pictures. In the end, it really wouldn't have mattered that much, because the FBI and law enforcement have ways of retrieving most of those images. Sometimes it's difficult, sometimes they can't, but for the most part, they're pretty good about finding these images on, I don't know exactly the technology, but they're able to do it. Even if they're deleted, they can go retrieve them. So I think to understand Stefan Stearns, I need to talk about something called a paraphilia. A paraphilia is, according to the DSM, which is our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in this case, the 5th edition is the latest. There's a revision to the 5th edition. A paraphilia is basically a persistent and intense sexual interest. It's persistent and intense sexual interest, urges, fantasies, or behaviors that are atypical in nature. In other words, a paraphilia involves what in my field we sometimes call deviant sexual interest. So an example of a paraphilia would be pedophilia. And pedophilia, one thing about a paraphilia, by the way, a couple things about a paraphilia. Number one, for it to be considered, for a paraphilia to be considered a disorder, it has to cause distress for the individual involved, and or it can involve harm to others. So you could have someone, so a pedophile, for example, is someone who is essentially attracted to children, typically prepubescent children, 13 and under. And you could have a situation where somebody could have that attraction, and it could be a primary attraction, but it doesn't cause them any distress. But it's considered a disorder because obviously if you have that attraction and you act on it, you're going to harm a child. You're going to harm a vulnerable member of our society, and that would then be a disorder. So it's interesting to think of Stefan Stearns coming into Madeline Soto's life when she's 6 years old and he's 30. I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting that Stefan Stern's primary relationship is with Madeline and not Jennifer.
Okay, right.
And
I've sensed that. So, okay.
And that's problematic. Obviously, some of the evidence for that, the best friend I just talked about told detectives that Stefan was always, quote, always on the phone texting and talking with Stefan. So over the course of a day, Stefan was in touch with Madeline all the time. A friend who was interviewed, a gaming friend of Stefan for several years, was interviewed by detectives. His name is Frank Peralta. You can find him in the documents. He said, quote, Stefan was more upset about the bond he created with Madeline than having a relationship with Jennifer after Jennifer ended the relationship with him. So in other words, he didn't care that Jennifer broke up with him. He cared about the fact that his bond with Madeline was severed.
Mm-hmm.
We also know, based upon these documents, that Stefan really didn't have much of a sexual relationship with Jennifer. Jennifer said it was because of medication she was taking, but it seems to me that it was more than that, and we'll talk about this in a minute, because Stefan dated someone in 2022, and I don't know if that was an affair. I'm not quite sure what that was exactly. It's not clear cut. Maybe it was a moment when Stefan and Jennifer had broken up. I don't know.
Yeah, that was an interesting relationship. We'll get to that.
So, but you have a situation here where you have a 30-year-old who's developing this really close bond with a 6-year-old who really doesn't apparently have much of a physical interest in the mother. He's spending considerable time with Madeline, right? He's texting her all the time. He's talking to her. He mentions that he tells this girlfriend, her first name is Marilee. He tells Marilee asks him to stay over at her house. This is in 2022. And he tells her, no, he basically can't do that because Madeline can't sleep unless he's in bed with her.
With Madeline.
So,
right.
With Madeline, right. So he has to go home. He can't be with the girlfriend. He has to go home because Madeline expects that he's going to be, go to bed. And that Madeline has a strong need to, quote, snuggle with him to go to sleep. Obviously, these are all red flags. This is not normal behavior for a 30 to 37-year-old and a 6 to 13-year-old. So that's the period we're talking about. We're talking about 7 years. Let me just talk about, so the research on pedophiles is not super clear cut, but there are some broad findings that I just want to talk about quickly here. It's believed that pedophilic disorder develops during adolescence, and often pedophiles come from abuse or neglect in the home, or many of them are deprived of close relationships in childhood. So there's some probability that they're going to have attachment issues, which, as many of our listeners probably know, seems to be a common theme among a lot of criminals. They often experience sexual and relationship difficulties. that lead them into relationships with children where they feel in control and they feel a greater sense of mastery over those relationships. So that's a big part of this is, and I believe, and I've worked, by the way, I've worked with a lot of sex offenders and a lot of pedophiles over the years, and that is a common theme that I've observed, is that there's this discomfort with adult relationships, that they're more at ease and they're more emotionally connected to children than pedophiles are than they are to adults. And one of the reasons for that is that they believe they can control children's reactions to them, that they can prevent children from rejecting them, they can prevent children from belittling them, right? That they have more control over how children are going to treat them. Whereas adults obviously are more independent and have the capacity to reject and to leave and to, to give them negative feedback, right? To let them know that they have flaws. And pedophiles aren't fond of learning that they have flaws. So often they're quite insecure about that. Some other elements of pedophiles, typically that they're immature. And they tend to be quite anxious. As I just mentioned, they tend to be quite anxious about normal adult sexual relationships. Another element is the pedophiles have a tendency to blame children for their sexual relationships. This was something I found to be very common. I remember there was a pedophile I worked with for like 7 years. And his thing was always, it took years to get past this, but his argument was always that his victim, who happened to be around the same age as Madeline, that she came onto him, that she was giving him signals of interest. And of course he had to act on that because she was showing romantic and sexual interest in him. And that's quite common in pedophiles, that there's this tendency to blame. There's also some research or evidence showing that brain abnormalities may play a role, specifically the frontal lobes and maybe the amygdala. They might be implicated in some of the attraction to children. So there could be some brain abnormalities or structural issues. And typically pedophiles also have at least one other major psychological disorder. So many of them have other mental health issues that are concurrent with the pedophilia. And I think that's probably true here as well, by the way. So I don't know what that is. I can't tell you what that other disorder would be, but it's interesting to know that on this issue of blame, that Stefan told his father, Chris, he was having a conversation with Chris, and the detectives heard this. And Chris asked him if Stefan was involved in what happened. And he answered, yeah. And then he said something interesting. He said, yeah, well, I didn't start it. Now, I guess there's a lot of ways you can interpret that, but one way that I would interpret it is he's blaming the victim. He's essentially saying, well, I didn't start it. Madeline started it.
That's how I take it.
She showed interest in me. She's the one who came on to me. And along those lines, there was a moment in the documents when Stefan, during his interview, mentioned that Madeline had engaged in, he was very vague, but he said that she had engaged in some sexual stuff when she was much younger on her phone. And he couldn't recall what it was. But the implication of that, again, it speaks to this issue of blaming the victim. The issue there is he's implying that, well, yeah, you know what? Madeline was already sexual before I met her. She was already overly sexualized as a little girl. And there was a sexual stuff. I don't quite remember what it was. he describes it in his interviews as a sexual incident when she was younger. And he said, yeah, there was a sexual incident. He said, but quote, but she wasn't scolded for it. He said that, right? But so he's clearly trying to pin this on Madeline.
Yeah.
And suggest that she's the one who's sexual. She's the one who came on to me. She's the one who wanted this.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is quite common with pedophiles and sex offenders in general, by the way. So, but in particular with offenders that have an attraction to minors.
You said something was wrong with their brain, and we got like 6 questions all at once about a possible TBI that he had when he was younger, a traumatic brain injury. Do those, and I know it's a bit of a tangent, but to ask, because so many questions came down about it, can that also play a part? He had a traumatic brain injury as a child, Stephen Stearns did.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it could absolutely play a role. I mean, there's no clear-cut answers to what creates a pedophile at this point. But yes, the brain abnormalities could definitely play a role. So
Okay.
it is, yeah, and that's worth pointing out. Thank you for pointing that out, because yeah, the TBI, depending on the severity and the parts of the brain it affected, especially if it affects the amygdala, which is kind of the emotional center of the brain, that could have a real impact on his ability to connect to other human beings emotionally, which could lead him to this immaturity, and it could lead him to kind of these developmental delays and these relationship deficits, which leads him to congruence. The term we use is he has emotional congruence with kids. So it leads to this emotional congruence with kids where he feels more comfortable with kids. In some ways, you could argue that the TBI stunts his development. So if the TBI occurs when he's 8, let's say hypothetically, then maybe in some ways he's similar to that age, and he relates to children that are 8. And that, by the way, could be part of the issue here. I think one of the things that Stephen Stearns was struggling with was the fact that Madeline was reaching puberty in January of 2024. She started her menstrual cycle.
Oh, just 1 month prior.
Well, yeah, 1.5 months prior to the murder. And she was developing a crush on different boys. She was talking about boys at school and at home. Stephen actually heard her talking about that. So there was this increased sense of independence. And my guess is that these changes were having a major impact on Stephen. In many ways, I think Stephen was interested in keeping her regressed or keeping her infantile. He didn't want her to grow up. And that's something, by the way, I've seen with a lot of pedophiles. If they target a specific victim and that victim now starts reaching puberty or getting older, a lot of times they'll lose interest and they'll try to find other victims at that point that are more consistent with their fantasies. So yes, so it's hard. Again, it's hard to tease out all the different elements that might create a pedophile. But I mean, I mentioned some of them. Many of these would run together. So yeah, the TBI could certainly play a role.
Thank you. Moving on.
So let's say hypothetically, and again, I don't know for sure. It seems like has some qualities of a pedophile, but I mean, I can't diagnose him as a pedophile. I haven't met him or talked to him or interviewed him, but he clearly has this interest in this young girl, and it appears to me like he's targeted Jennifer to reach Madeline. In fact, it kind of reminds me, for those on the book club, one month we talked about Abducted in Plain Sight, which I'm sure you'll remember well, is about a pedophile who targets a young girl, and he develops a relationship with the parents to get to the young girl. And in fact, he goes so far as to have sexual relationships with both parents so that he can have access to their daughter when he needs access to the daughter. And if he's, because of those sexual relationships, he has leverage, and he uses that as a type of extortion to get his way.
Okay.
So let's dig a little bit deeper. So you have this potential pedophilic interest in younger children. But one of the things in the documents that's really fascinating is on his phone, there were a number of images with Madeline. And I can't, in my job, I would read these images, but on YouTube, I would read what these are, but I can't hear. So
Right. Even I didn't read them in the evidence. It was in the evidence, and I actually just lessened it. So,
but let me just, I'm going to give our listeners a sense of why this is so important and why we need to talk. If you want to understand Stefan Cerns, you got to understand this stuff. So on one of the pictures, Stefan is using okay, I'm gonna back up here. Stefan this is on image. The images are numbered. I'm not going to read the numbers. You guys can find these if you want to look at them. But let's call this image 1. Stefan is engaging in sexual activity while quote while the victim appears to be sleeping, unquote. Image number 2. Stefan is engaging in sexual behavior, quote, while the victim appears to be sleeping, unquote. Image number 3. Stefan is engaging in sexual behavior, quote, while the victim appears to be sleeping, unquote. I can go on. Image number 4.
Go ahead.
Image number 4. Stefan is engaging in sexual behavior, quote, while the victim appears to be sleeping, unquote.
So we see a theme.
Right. There's a theme, and there's a term for that. That also is another paraphilia. So that's why I wanted to lead with paraphilias. There's a paraphilia for this. It's called somnophilia. And I've assessed hundreds of sex offenders over the year. I've had probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 cases of somnophilia. They're very rare. But this is a really critical component of this case. So somnophilia is essentially sexual activity with someone who is sleeping and or unconscious. So there's some dispute about this, by the way, because initially somnophilia was called Sleeping Beauty syndrome. And what that meant was that someone who was a somnophiliac would target someone who was sleeping. They would engage in start sexual activity with that person. The person would wake up, sort of like Sleeping Beauty when the prince kisses her, she wakes up. Same thing, that a somnophiliac was initially thought to derive their sexual interest from someone who woke up from sleep when they started sexual activity. However, that definition has changed over time to include unconscious people, unconscious victims, because it's not at all clear cut. The current research is much more complicated. It doesn't appear that the main type of arousal is from the victim waking. And I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Mm.
So what's important about, okay, so let me, I'm sorry. I've got so much to juggle here. I'm just kind of losing track of.
It's okay. And I'm staying quiet so that you can juggle away.
I'm trying to juggle a lot of information here, so stay with me. Um, okay. I want to talk a little bit about some fairly recent research. This is an article. I'm sure you guys may not be able to see it. This is an article called Somnophilia, Examining Its Various Forms and Associated Constructs. This is from a journal called Sexual Abuse, 2021. So it's fairly recent. Volume 33. It's Elizabeth Dehan and Ross Bartels. This is an important article on somnophilia. What the authors found was that somnophilia is highly correlated with, you guys, I hope you're sitting down for this one. Somnophilia is highly correlated with necrophilia, sadistic fantasies, sexual dominance, and assault fantasies. So there's certain terms I can't use on YouTube, but there's a paraphilia called beastophilia, which is essentially where arousal is dependent upon assaulting an unconsenting person. So there's a term I can't use on YouTube, but beastophilia it's the R word.
Okay.
It's
Yeah. Yep.
It's basically arousal that's dependent upon sexual assault.
Yeah. Got it.
And so what the research is showing now is and necrophilia, for those who don't know, that is arousal with a deceased person or a corpse. And what's important about this is what they all have in common is not only the lack of consent, but sort of this violent component.
Yeah.
That there's
Clearly.
right there's absolutely no empathy for the victims.
Gosh.
As I'm going to read a little bit from Dehan and Bartels from the article I just mentioned. In their study, they say, quote, "These results provide support for the view that somnophilia is linked to an interest in non-consensual sex." They go on. Sadistic fantasies and the need for sexual dominance were correlated positively with active somnophilia. So if you think of consent as occurring along a continuum from obviously someone who's conscious to someone who's completely unconscious on the other end, or let's go further, someone who's deceased, somnophilia is definitely at the end towards deceased, right? And so there's different forms that this paraphilia can take, which is that someone could be sleeping, they could be drugged, they could be comatose, or they could be dead, right? And I'm going to continue reading from some of the documents. Quote, "There were text messages between Stefan and Jennifer claiming that Stefan gave Madeline an extra dose of her medication when it was not necessary." What was her medication? She took hydroxyzine. Hydroxyzine is an anxiety medication, and it's also an anesthetic for surgery that can render people unconscious. Stefan, when they searched his cell phones, Stefan did a search for a drug called sevoflurane. Sevoflurane is also a general anesthetic that causes a loss of consciousness before and during surgery. Stefan was searching for the item he searched for specifically and looking for this drug was, quote, show up in a drug test, unquote. So I think you guys, hopefully I'm developing a picture here where this is someone who is clearly pushing the boundaries when it comes to consensual sex. I mean, you can't, a pedophile, a pedophile obviously doesn't engage in consensual sex because it's a minor, right? But if you take it to the next level and you start getting into somnophilia,
it gets even worse. We're all with you. We're all with you. So,
right.
Yeah, you don't need to explain it. Yeah.
Right. You're rendering someone unconscious. So let's move on to this next piece of information is just stunning. So I'm going to read this. So Stefan dated this woman. Her name's Marilee. I'm not going to mention her last name. You guys can find this in the docs if you want to take a look. They had a brief intimate relationship. I'm going to read what Marilee told the detective. The detective asked her about their intimate relationship. In other words, her intimate relationship with Stefan. Marilee disclosed that, quote, Stefan had a tough time having an erection. Marilee described one very weird occasion where Stefan had her lay face down completely flat, as if she was dead, and he had sexual intercourse with her. Marilee said that was the only time that he was ever very erect. And she said it was.
There you go. That's all. Yeah. There you go. Confirming where you're going. Right.
Right. So now you can see, right, exactly. So now you can see how somnophilia could be related to some of these to necrophilia. Right. And when you learn this about Stefan Stearns, it really raises the question for me. It raises the question of what happened that evening that Madeline was harmed, right? Was she drugged? We know that she was, that the cause of death was strangulation. Right? Was she drugged? Here's a frightening thought. I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, but
don't. I mean, I think we already need to maybe be a little bit more.
Okay. Right. I mean, so I'm sure our listeners can go to some of the, right, I'm sure their imaginations will carry down to some of the darkest spots you could imagine, but I don't think it's unreasonable to go there here. When you learn that he's having necrophilic fantasies.
Right.
Right? It doesn't take long to figure out what the possibilities are here and how horrid that is.
Right.
So, I mean, did he harm her because of those fantasies? Right? Like, I think this is going to push us closer to what occurred.
Right.
that night. I think basically there's two scenarios that you can come up with, that I can come up with here. One is that there was some type of altercation
That's
where
one possibility, yeah.
one is that there was an altercation where Madeline, maybe she was drugged, she woke up, she was, even for her, it was too much. She fought back, right? Something like that. There's some situation where Madeline becomes upset and Stefan has to subdue her, strangle her. The other possibility, I think, is that it may have been an accident, that perhaps he was engaged in some type of erotic asphyxiation. It seems like something he would probably do. Maybe she was partially drugged. I don't know, but he didn't intend necessarily to harm her. And he did. He went too far. The argument for that, I think, would be the fact that he knew that Jennifer was downstairs. And if he inadvertently killed her, I think he probably recognized that he would have to find a way around Jennifer. And he, right? Like, it's, if you're going to do something like this that's completely premeditated, you're probably not going to do it in an upstairs bedroom of your ex when she's downstairs on the couch and can hear you, right? It seems to me, but I mean, but then again, this is someone who is pretty, Stefan is someone who's, by most accounts, he's pretty impulsive. And so it's probably not something he was thinking about. I think he was obviously thinking about his own gratification. And you know, this event occurred, and then he had to try to solve it. Not well, by the way, but I mean, but he was put in that predicament. So I think the important point is that when you combine, for me, when you combine some elements of pedophilia with elements of somnophilia with some necrophilic fantasies, that's a prescription for, that's a prescription for disaster.
Clearly.
And that's what happened here. And then when you take the fact, I think that Madeline was getting older. I think she was becoming more independent. There could have been some jealousy about her new crushes. He could have been threatened by the fact that he couldn't control her as much. If one of the goals of a pedophile is to master the relationship and control the relationship, then he was probably losing some control as she got older. He was certainly losing control when Jennifer kicked him out of the house, essentially, and he wasn't around Madeline as much. So maybe he saw this as a window of opportunity to engage in this type of behavior one last time before he was exiled back to Northport. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities here. I think the fact that Madeline was reaching puberty and menstruating also meant that she could get pregnant.
Correct.
Right? Is it possible? Is it possible that she was pregnant? I don't know. Like, I mean, I want to know if, I presume law enforcement's going to look at these things, but did she have drugs in her system? Was she pregnant? Right? If she was pregnant and she told him, I'm keeping this baby, that would not go, I'm sure that would not sit well with him. So,
or just the fear that she could be.
Or the fear, right? I mean, exactly. So, could that be a motive? You know, I think there's some interesting motives here. I mean, obviously they're all tragic, but if we're trying to figure this out and understand it, I think these elements are absolutely critical for really, getting below the surface and getting a picture of what really happened that night. So this narrative about that I initially started with, that maybe this is just a psychopath that, engages in murder, I don't think it's that. That's not to say that's not to say I don't know Stephen Stearns, so that's not to say there couldn't be some elements of that. There might be. You could have a psychopath who's a pedophile who is a somnophiliac, right? You could have has necrophilic fan. You could have all that, but it seems to me that that this really starts with the sexual deviance, with the paraphilias, and that you have to understand those to understand Stephen Stearns. And if you throw on a personality disorder or some other stuff, sure, that would help. That would help our understanding. But I really think what happened that night of the 25th, February 25th, it really had to do with the sexual deviance that Stephen Stearns was struggling with, or that, these paraphilias that he had.
Okay.
Or I guess I should say he allegedly have, because I can't prove it. I don't, I haven't met him or interviewed him.
And where was her mother this whole time?
Right. Where was her mother? Yeah, should we start? You want to close in on
Yes.
that question?
I would like to. Yeah. I would like to know about Jen, because this is heartbreaking. We learned about Stefan, but her mother was downstairs and had been for 6 years, 7 years, or in the same room as her. So not just that night.
I just want to close this thought on somnophilia with a quote from Dehan and Bartles, the article, because I think this really helps make sense of what somnophilia and necrophilia are about. And the quote is, quote, "It could be argued that non-consensual somnophilia is driven by an underlying interest in passivity, power, and the elimination of the possibility of rejection, rather than an overt interest in sexual aggression." And that's really important, because I do believe, and this is true of pedophiles in general, the one of the reasons that they have this emotional congruence with children is because they don't want to get rejected. They don't want that feeling of being abandoned, and they can have more control over those relationships with children. And that's exactly what they're saying about somnophilia, and that would be true of necrophilia and biastophilia as well. So I think that's an important point. This idea of the sex offender seeking power and strength and control. And in fact, there's a quote from where did I put it? There's a quote from Jen saying about Stefan that he would become angry at Maddie if she, quote, didn't want to do what was asked of her.
Well, there you go.
So apparently he was mad at her a lot, but he was obviously interested in this issue of control and power. And this, by the way, this is a predominant theme that we always talk about with many criminals, which is this transformation from weakness and vulnerability and shame and rejection, and transforming that into the sense of dominance and mastery and omnipotence and power. And you see that here, I think, that the reason he's targeting Madeline and a young girl is to feel this sense of power and to eliminate the possibility of rejection. Okay, so are we?
Yes.
Do we have time? Do we have time to cover?
I hope so. Not too long. That's why I wanted to jump to Jen, because
right.
we are all wondering.
Okay, couple things. Let me start with a couple things with Jen. The detectives do an interview with Jennifer, and the detective showed her some of the photographs of the images that I just talked about earlier, which clearly show Stefan engaging in these illegal behaviors with Madeline. And Jen said that at that point, Jen said she thought Stefan was guilty. And then she said this. The detective said, I asked her what she thought Stefan was guilty of. And she replied, quote, he's been grooming and abusing my child.
Yes, Jen. Yes.
I asked her what she thought Stefan was guilty of, and she replied, quote, he's been grooming and abusing my child. So my question there, I mean, I don't think that's one of the most important statements in all of these documents, by the way. She recognizes. So the question here is, does she know that before?
Right.
Her
That's the
daughter's harm?
question.
Or does she have the insight after, right? Like, that's what I'm struggling with here.
That's the question, right? Is okay, she realizes it in this interview, but did she just all of a suddenly realize this after 6 or 7 years? Or did she know?
Right. And that's the big question. I mean, I kind of go back and forth. I don't think that grooming is a term that a lot of mothers typically would know unless they've thought about it. So if I had to guess, it seems to me she's been thinking about this.
Yeah.
Or considering it, which would imply that she knows.
Right. As Blue Sky says, yes, she knew. So people think she knew. Kim's asking, when did she figure it out? Right.
Yeah, when did she figure it out? And then, of course, we have the statement about early on the detective pressed her about whether sleeping arrangements in the home, and Jen initially says, no, I've got a strict rule. I love this. I've got a strict rule that there's no sleeping. It's I'm sorry, it's funny because it's so absurd. Like, right. to go from having a strict rule about not sleeping in the same bed to, okay, yeah, I needed some sleep because I had a new job.
And I sent them up to Maddie's bed.
Right. It's preposterous, right? Like, but I mean, and also it shows her state of mind. Like, I mean, she's lying. She starts out by trying to deny that they slept in the same bed. She's flat out lying. And then finally they press her and she caves and says, yeah, I wanted a good night's sleep because I'm starting a job and I sent my daughter up to sleep with them. But, hey, I trust him, right? She also said that. She said, I trust him because he treats her like a father. Okay. Not a good father.
Some people suggest she was willfully blind, willfully ignorant, and bringing up that she said that after learning about the photographs.
Yeah, I don't know.
This is where we lie. I know this is
what makes this so difficult, right? Like, in on that issue, by the way, this is something I encountered all the time in the child protection system. There's a child maltreatment charge called failure to protect. I'm going to read from an article here. This is from the journal Children and Youth Services Review. The title of the article is Substantiated Allegations of Failure to Protect in the Child Welfare System. It's by Colleen Henry et al. Quote, failure to protect, also abbreviated FTP, failure to protect, a subset of neglect, is used by child welfare systems to categorize and substantiate allegations of child maltreatment. Scholars and advocates have raised concerns that failure to protect is disproportionately used to substantiate mothers and people of color for harm perpetuated by others, particularly in the context of sexual abuse and domestic violence. So why is that important? Because this would potentially be a clear-cut case of failure to protect. However, the criticism around failure to protect is that if Jen doesn't know, if we argue that her grooming comment occurred after the fact, after she learned what happened and was shown the picture, and then she has this realization of what happened, and she doesn't know, let's say hypothetically, she really doesn't think abuse is occurring.
Right.
Then you're blaming the victim. She's a victim. She lost her daughter.
She is a victim. Right. And she wasn't there. Yeah.
So the problem with failure to protect is, and I've done groups with a lot of women. These are like the angriest women I've ever worked with in therapy, by the way. They're called non-offending parents groups. Failure to protect applies to the parent that didn't offend, the non-offending parent. And the reason why the women in these groups were so angry is because their argument was they didn't know and they didn't do anything wrong. And here the system is targeting them when in fact the onus should be, the responsibility for the offense should be squarely placed on the shoulders of the offender and not them. Right? That's the issue, is if she doesn't know, I mean, let's say this. At the very least, she's a really bad mother. Okay, we can say that for sure. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that she really doesn't think there's any abuse going on.
Okay. For the sake of argument. Okay.
Right. Should we then vilify her? Right? Why are we vilifying her when Stefan Stearns, if Stefan Stearns has a moral compass and doesn't commit any crimes or do what he's doing, then we're not here now. We're not discussing this. None of this happens. So I think a lot of this hinges on what she knows, what Jennifer knows, and when she knows it, right? But let's have a discussion. Let's try to have a quick discussion here about reasons why parents do not protect their children.
Well, and Lori Vallow didn't protect her children either.
Yeah. Right.
Different case. She also did not protect her children and gave them up to their killer as well. And Lori Vallow is same. Which brings me to something people are bringing up, and you said you're juggling a lot, so if this is too soon, go forward with what you're going to say, but Jen's history, because there's also a part of me that wonders if she did know or if she was in denial. Like, either way, does her history play a part in either the denial or allowing it to happen?
So let's run through some possible reasons why Jen in particular, but more broadly, parents or mothers fail to protect their kids. And by the way, there is men do get charged with failure to protect, but way less than women.
Interesting.
And mainly for substance abuse. So women typically take all the blame for sexual abuse and domestic violence. Men don't. But men do get cited and charged with failure to protect in the family court system, typically because they're drug addicts, essentially. So there is this differential in the system that treats women differently than men. And that would be a long discussion, by the way. So we don't have time to get into that, but that would be an interesting discussion about why there's gender bias in the system. I think the most obvious reason is because there's certain expectations about the role of being a mother.
Yeah.
And if you fail in that role, then you're going to get blamed. Because
that's interesting.
Because in this case, it's clearly Madeline is Jennifer's child and not Stefan's. So the general presumption in the family court system is she's responsible.
Yeah.
If she's murdered, she's responsible. She should have done better. She should have been a better mother, right? Even if she doesn't know. If she has the suspicion, or if she thinks that it's unusual that her daughter is sleeping in the same bed with some guy all the time, a guy who, by the way, identifies as having kinks. I can't get more specific about that, but in the documents he has kinks that probably, there would probably be of enough concern that you wouldn't want to put your child in bed with him. But let's look at some of the reasons. So the first, I wrote down some of the reasons why parents struggle to protect their children. Sometimes the first would be fear, plain and simple fear. That Jen is afraid for her physical safety. She's in a home with coercive control. We talked about this in our first episode. In those interviews, you see Stefan hovering over her, right? He's got this menacing kind of hovering quality where he's looming over her.
You discussed this in our very first episode. This is what you pointed out. They're at right.
So let's so just at a basic level, and let me say too, I'm not here to excuse her behavior. My job is to try to promote some degree of understanding, right? Like when I go in and assess a criminal that's committed murder, my job is not to vilify that person. My job is to try to be as objective as possible and to develop some understanding of why this happened and what the consequences should be. And so I'm not making excuses for Jen. I know when I talk about this issue, I know a lot of people, some people get upset and they say, oh, you're excusing it, you're letting her off the hook. I'm not. I'm just trying to understand it.
It's a puzzle.
It's a puzzle. If she knew that her child was being abused, then please charge her. If she knew that if she was a co-conspirator in the murder and you have the proof, please get her for murder. I'll be the first person to go along with that. But in the absence of that evidence, let's try to figure out why this happened. The first reason is fear. So this is a real primal, basic explanation, and that is that Jen Soto is afraid for her life. There's a safety issue here. She's with a guy that's coercively controlling. She's with a guy who wants to exert power. She's with a guy that has necrophilic fantasies, for God's sakes. Like, this guy knows no limits. So she feels a threat to her physical, emotional, and sexual safety. That's pretty compelling. So let's start with that, because that's a really basic reason. There's other reasons. Let's stay with the fear issue. I think a lot of women in her position, if they report the abuse, they have a fear of being seen as a bad mother.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like they experience a lot of guilt. They're going to experience a lot of shame over the fact that they didn't protect their child. That they would be considered a bad mother by the community and by the CPS system. That's a fear. They have a fear of losing their child to CPS. If they report, a lot of these women are afraid that the child will be taken from them and placed in the foster care system, worst case.
Mm-hmm.
Jen Soto also appears to be the victim of abuse herself. We have an excerpt from her notebook indicating that she was likely traumatized as a child. I don't know if it's physical or sexual abuse, but she appears to be the victim of abuse. So there's another fear, and that's the fear of being re-traumatized. She's afraid of being re-traumatized based on her past abuse. She's afraid of uncovering all those feelings of shame and inadequacy from her own abuse if she discloses. So you have all these unbearable emotions, all these overwhelming emotions from her own abuse that she probably doesn't want to revisit. So that's another fear. There's more reasons. Often women that don't protect their children, they tend to be somewhat narcissistic. They're self-absorbed. Sometimes women, they find the ideal of having a child. The ideal of a child is more compelling than the reality. A lot of women will have children with this silly notion that they'll get unconditional love from their child, and then when they have a child, they start realizing that it's the other way around. That the parent's job is to provide love and protection to the child. It's not the child's job to do that for the parent. So there's this naive kind of magical idea that if you have a child, that all your problems will be solved because now you're going to feel the love you always wanted to feel. But the love is for you. It's not for the child. It's not reciprocal. A relationship with a child is not reciprocal. Right? It's more sacrificial. Right. The parent's job,
yes.
The parent's job is to provide for the child, not the opposite. And I think oftentimes with women that don't protect their kids, they have this irrational idea of how being a parent will be and what a mother means, and that somehow this child is going to give them all this love that they never had and heal all their wounds. And that clashes with the reality. Another reason that sometimes the parents don't protect their kids is mental health. That clearly Jen Soto is someone with serious mental health problems. In fact, her first husband, Stephen,
not to be confused, not Stefan, not to be confused with Stefan, Stephen. Yes.
Stephen divorced Jennifer in her first marriage in 2015 because of mental health. He said essentially that she was falling apart, that he was taking over all the household chores and responsibilities. She was doing nothing. He was afraid of how bad her mental health was getting. And so he left because he couldn't go any further. So he divorced her. So that would indicate that you have someone basically who, she might have depression, she might have anxiety, she might have PTSD from her abusive past. So she's got these traumas. She herself says in her notes that she can't function. And so if you have someone with severe mental health problems and they can't really care, they can't even care for themselves, they're going to have a really hard time caring for a child.
Yeah.
So in this case, I think you have a really limited human being with limited capabilities. And I think because of that, it does create what psychologists call inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is that sometimes we refuse to see the obvious in the situation because we're so focused on our own needs and our own survival. And I think that's true here.
That's certainly true.
The classic case of this is an experiment called the invisible gorilla, where these subjects come in and they're asked to count the balls that people are throwing around in a circle. And then these gorillas come in the room and kind of mix with the group throwing the balls around. And then the gorillas leave. And the researchers ask the participants, did you see the gorillas? And the numbers are astonishing. Like upwards of 60% of the participants don't see the gorillas.
Huh.
And the reason they don't see the gorillas is because of inattentional blindness, because they're so focused on counting the balls. They think the purpose of the experiment and the goal is to count the balls. They don't know that the purpose of the experiment is to see if they can focus on the gorillas in addition to the balls. But for Jen Soto, she can't see the gorillas because she's just trying to get through the day. She's just trying to survive. She's just trying to manage her depression and manage her trauma. She's taking a lot of medications to do that. So I think that factors into this. And again, I'm not excusing, I'm not saying that she shouldn't protect her child, but I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to provide a possible explanation about why protecting Madeline was difficult for her. Not impossible, but difficult.
Gotcha.
Another reason that a parent might struggle to protect a child is dependency. You and I talk a lot about attachment issues, and attachment issues are really key in terms of developing healthy relationships. Jen Soto, if she was abused, which appears she was, she probably had an insecure attachment as a child, which means that she will struggle to develop healthy relationships in the future. So when she develops relationships, they're probably not very healthy. And she probably has a lot of dependency. She probably seeks validation and support from other people. And in this case, Stefan, doesn't really matter who the person is, but the basic idea is that women like Jen Soto don't want to be alone. They don't know how to be alone. They don't know how to be independent. They don't know how to be outside of a relationship. And that's largely because they felt unlovable as children. They have these insecure attachments. And the consequence of that is they will seek love from even the most dysfunctional partners at any cost. And once they find that love, they don't want to leave. They want to maintain it. And that has to do with dependency. So, you see that here. One of the detectives says in the documents that she's protecting Stefan over her daughter, and that she's prioritizing Stefan.
That's in the docs. Yeah.
In an interview, Jen says that she shares much more with Stefan than Madeline. She told the Orange County Sheriff that. Her mother, Yolanda, Jen's mother, said Jennifer just doesn't want to be alone. When asked why she stays with Stefan, that's what her mother says.
That's an important part that often gets overlooked. Will you say that one more time? This is in the docs from her mother.
Yeah, this is from Yolanda Zambrano, who's Jen's mother. The mother said, "Did you like Stefan?" She said no, and because he doesn't work and he's lazy. And the detective said, "Well, why do you think she stays with him?" And she said, "Jennifer doesn't want to be alone. She just can't be alone." Right. And that speaks to this issue of dependency. Sadly and tragically, some parents, women, mothers, they would prefer to be in the most dysfunctional, unhealthy relationship, no matter what, just so they don't have to be alone.
We will get to the poem, Denise. Yes. And Jen's notebook too. I have these up. I can share these docs.
Okay. Do you want to do that now?
Oh, yeah. I was waiting.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought, okay.
This is what we believe is Jen's notebook. It is not labeled, but we have done our handwriting analysis and our writing analysis, and we have come to the conclusion, the two of us, that this is Jen's notebook. Some people online have referred to it as Maddie's. We do not believe that this is Maddie's. We believe that this is Jen's notebook. So she writes, number 5, my fluctuating moods, anxiety, and trauma-related symptoms affect my memory, concentration, focus, and energy levels. I also have severe trauma responses when I encounter all males. My illness and conditions, this is crossed out, limit my ability to work by affecting my memory. Also erased or crossed out is something about being reminded of her perpetrator. Perpetrator is that very last crossed out word. What does this say about Jen?
I think this speaks to a lot of the issues we've just been discussing, the mental health issues and some of the fears I talked about. also let's talk. There's the cycle of abuse.
Cycle of abuse. Yeah, someone wrote intergenerational trauma. And that's what I
Right.
wondered too is, you would think that if she were abused, so many mothers that were abused are hyper vigilant, then they're going to make sure she should be more aware, right? Like in some senses, like, okay, if she was abused and she has a perpetrator that she's talking about, then my goodness, wouldn't that mean that she should be more aware? But 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 you're saying though, in some cases, maybe she could become more willfully ignorant. Maybe her mental health could be worse. Maybe, but I have to talk about this. I have to ask this. There's a part of me that wonders, does she know? And in some way, she wants her daughter to feel the same shame she felt. I have to ask that because someone that has a history of abuse, sending her own daughter up to a bedroom with
Yeah.
an adult male, does she know, or is she willfully ignorant, yet in some ways wanting her daughter to feel the same shame she has felt?
Yeah, I think so. I've talked about the idea of Freud called it the repetition compulsion. The modern version of that is what's called self-verification theory. Self-verification theory is that essentially we want our lives to be coherent. We want our stories to be coherent, and we'll do almost anything to maintain that coherence, even if it causes us pain or suffering. And I think this is a big part of Jen's story. Part of Jen's story is, well, I wasn't protected as a child, so you won't be.
Right.
I
That's what I'm
suffered
wondering.
I suffered as a child. I experienced all this shame, so now I want you to. And I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying that's conscious. The cycle of abuse is not conscious. It's often quite the opposite. It's occurring out of awareness. But you have all of these repressed feelings of anger and shame and inadequacy that are really overwhelming and hard to deal with. And so one way of dealing with those feelings is to put them on your daughter, in this case, to project them on their daughter. It's what you sometimes call the voodoo doll effect.
Yeah, that's what I call it, like a voodoo doll, almost. Maddie is her voodoo doll in
Right.
some sense, is
It's the
how I explain it.
voodoo doll effect. Yeah, I'm experiencing pain, so you need to have that same pain. And again, this isn't conscious. It's a type of projection. It's a way for her to deal with her own feelings of shame and inadequacy, and to try to put them outside of herself onto her daughter, so that she doesn't have to feel them at the same level. And part of this is that some victims of abuse, not all, but some victims of abuse, there's this confusion with love and abuse. Like, you have love and abuse and the sexual stuff all occurring at the same time. So you have all these confusing associations. And, and so I think many mothers would say, no, I would never want that to happen. But that's oftentimes not, again, this doesn't happen that much, but they don't know how else to deal with it. It's because it's such a coherent part of their story. In some ways, they don't know how to prevent it from occurring to someone else, like Madeline.
Right. It's a possibility.
Yeah, right. I'm not saying it's definitive.
Yeah.
There's all these elements, these fears for her physical safety. There's these mental health issues. There's her past abuse. There's some narcissistic features. There's this dependency in relationships, and this need to be, to not be alone, that even her mother recognizes. Right? These are all elements that kind of combine they aggregate to create
Yep.
this scenario. And again, like, I'm not excusing it, I'm not justifying it, I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah. Yes. Right. You're just making points. We have one more poem, but that's probably towards the end. So, and we have a video too, but I think we already talked about that, so it might be repeat about how she wanted her to sleep upstairs.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
that video.
Yeah, I already
We're
read
done.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to play that. So
We can add it for our podcast version of this, which, by the way, if any of you haven't subscribed to our podcast, we have a great new episode there that is not been shared on YouTube. Well, it was years ago, but it's like a remastered episode. So we do things on our podcast that we don't do on YouTube, and I recommend everybody going there, and please hit subscribe there too. Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts.
So I think I covered some of the main points I wanted to make about protecting children. I'm sure there's others, and I'm sure some people will disagree with me, which is fine, because one of my goals here is to stimulate some really meaningful dialogue. These are hard issues. Let's talk about them. I'm not going to ever say that my version is correct. I'm just presenting my perspective, and it's a perspective, hopefully, that I've acquired through a lot of experience, but that doesn't mean I'm right. So feel free to chime in and let's talk about it.
Some people are saying it's so convenient that she had that notebook, or some people thinking we're suggesting we're making an excuse for her. But I actually feel like if Jen had been abused, it makes it worse. I would say that's an opposite of an excuse. It makes it even more appalling to me, because she should have known that. So just want to share that. Makes it worse.
Right. That you could argue that because of her abuse, that she should have more awareness, and if she's struggling, she should get help.
Yes.
She should get help. If she has concerns, she should get help so that she can figure it out, so that she doesn't continue the cycle of abuse, and she doesn't allow her daughter to be put in harm's way.
Yes.
And yeah, every time I talk about this issue, that I think that there's a natural response to make that argument that I'm just providing excuses. And I want to make it clear that I believe that Jennifer, at the best case, she's a horrible mother.
And that's best case, right?
Worst case, she should be charged for murder. But if that's the case, you got to show me the evidence. If she's a co-conspirator, there should be some evidence, demonstrating that. And so far, there's not enough.
Right, there isn't that evidence
that points in that direction at all. Here's an example. So the images they found, the thousands of images they found on Stefan's phone, if she was a co-conspirator, you'd expect to see her in a few of them.
Or to make it look like she had taken them or something.
Yeah, right. And as far as we know, maybe this will change, but as far as we know, she's not implicated in any of the images. And again, we don't know. It could change. They could charge her down the road. Who knows? But
there is no evidence that we can see of the things
right.
that have been, that could get her charged. So yeah, at this time. Right. Where would you like to go now, sweetheart?
Let me just circle back to where I started, and then if you want to, did you want to read the poem?
Oh, yeah.
I think we're going to skip the. I think we're going to skip the video I talked about. So
Okay.
let's just go. Let me circle back to where we started, and then you can finish with the poem if you have it.
I do have it. Yeah, I'll pull it up.
I think so. Let me just circle back. I started with the idea that Madeline felt invisible, and nobody really kind of saw and heard her. And so I think what's important, initially when I was looking through these documents, I thought this was a story about really bad parenting. Um, but then when I thought about it more, I realized that while bad parenting plays a role, I think it goes deeper than that. I think this is a story about being seen and being heard. And so the way that you can, if somebody's invisible, the way you can make them visible is to really listen to them, to really see them, to pay attention to them, to pay attention to everything. If they're crying in school, to see that. If they're saying that their mother's boyfriend is weird and they feel uncomfortable around them, to really listen to that. Right. And I think that's probably true of Jen Soto too. I don't think she felt very seen or heard either. And so
No.
for me, being seen and being heard is in many ways about feeling and experiencing love and
Mhm.
feeling like we have a place in the world, feeling like we have a home. And I think one of the things that breaks my heart tremendously about this case is this persistent theme that Madeline has about wanting to run away and go to the woods. When I hear that, I always have this sense that she really never felt at home anywhere. And that by escaping into the woods in some way, she just wants to disappear from the face of the earth.
Mm.
And, I guess my wish is that someone in her world, in particular her mother, I guess, would have taken more time just to see and hear and love her daughter so that she felt at home. Because running away in the woods is not home.
No.
And so I guess I will just end with the idea that just the importance of really taking the time to see and hear the people in our lives in a meaningful way. And to really be present with them when we're around them, not to take them for granted. And I think by doing that, hopefully we create a sense of inclusion and a sense of being home.
Thank you. Of the many emails that we received one from a hidden gem, Mel Stiller. She's been on chat tonight, who is a poet. And she wrote a poem for Madeline. And I asked Mel if I could read it. So this was written by Mel Stiller, a poet, a published poet, from Madeline's point of view. She sends her love and best regards from British Columbia, Canada. My name is Maddie by Mel Stiller. I was too little to understand why he always held me by the hand and pushed it where I couldn't see, where I didn't want my hand to be. I felt so sick inside my tummy, wanted to scream and call my mommy, but he told me to make no sound or he'd throw me onto the ground. I'd cry, but he would just persist and tied a rope around my wrist. He wanted one hand to be free so he could have his way with me. I cried and cried and called my mom. I called and called, but she didn't come. He'd say that she was sound asleep and I'd better not be such a creep. I was so young and didn't know that what he did would hurt me so. Yet down the hall, my mother slept while my heart sank and my eyes wept. Every time he came by to stay, he'd hurt me more and then he'd play. He'd tell my mom I was the best so she could sleep and get her rest. The years passed and I grew older. He'd hurt me more, but I got bolder. I told him that I'd have had enough and that I knew better and now was tough. That when he grew angry and bold, his hand went hard, his eyes went cold, and in no time I lost my breath and breathed my last before my death. I was 13, still just a child with a girl's dream, not really wild. Plenty of dreams I had in mind, big and small dreams of every kind. But he took them away simply because I wouldn't play. The nasty games he saved for me, the games my mother failed to see. Or did she know he was no fool under the sheets and in the pool? He did things that I can't explain, not then, not now, never again. All I remember from those days was the insistence of his ways. He'd smile at me and smooth my hair and made me want to die right there. During the night while my mom slept, he slithered quietly and I just wept. His touch was like a stabbing pain, a lightning bolt in freezing rain. He looked for me under the covers, told me we were the best of lovers. I felt his breath where it shouldn't be, where what he wanted belonged to me. Yet when I told my own mother that I wanted to live with my father, she very quickly let me know that I had nowhere else to go. During the day, my heart would yell that he had left and gone to hell. Teachers and friends would remedy the fear of night that lived in me. I know he hurt me and made me feel that I was nothing without his zeal. He drained my hopes to feed his whim and sold me to men just like him. Now that I'm gone from where his lies will always drown my mother's cries, I now know that I have the right to sleep alone with God in sight. We'll share that poem on our Facebook page, Hidden True Crime, as well as our other social media. Thank you, Mel, for sending that.
Yeah, thanks, Mel.
Yeah. Thanks, Mel. Yeah, we will share Mel's poem. So, with that, why don't we go? Thank you, Mel, for sharing that. Anything else, babe? Are we good?
I think we should end with the poem.
Okay. Okay. We'll see you guys. Have a great night.
All right. Good night.
Good night.